A medieval lie detector test just went off the charts. Did you really think medieval women were always miserable? Were their lives just an endless parade of misery and oppression? Get ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about the medieval era, a time stretching from the 5th to the 15th century, and the lives of women within it. Number 6. The biggest lie told about medieval women's happiness: they lacked all legal standing. For a long time, people thought medieval women were basically legal non-entities. The idea was that they had no rights, no control over property, and certainly no voice in legal matters. This picture of utter powerlessness is a giant oversimplification that misses a lot of the actual truth. Medieval legal systems, while certainly patriarchal in many ways, often provided women with surprising avenues for agency and protection. Consider the role of the unmarried woman, or a woman who had never been married, often called a feme sole. These women had a distinct legal identity. They could own land, sign contracts, and even represent themselves in court. Records from the borough courts of Bristol in the late 13th century show single women regularly engaging in trades, owning property, and suing or being sued in their own name. There was no male guardian automatically assigned to manage their affairs. A study of these court documents by Dr. Eleanor Searle shows numerous instances where single women navigated the legal landscape with competence and independence. A woman might inherit a shop from her parents and continue to run it, making all business decisions and dealing with suppliers and customers, all without male oversight. Now, marriage did complicate things. In many places, particularly under English common law, a married woman was often seen as covert by her husband. This concept, known as coverture, meant her legal identity was largely subsumed into his. Her husband managed her property, debts, and earnings. It sounds like total subjugation, and it certainly limited a married woman's independent action. However, even within coverture, there were important nuances and exceptions. For instance, a wife might still have legal rights to her paraphernalia, which included her clothes, jewels, and sometimes personal household items. These were considered her personal property, not her husband's, and could not be seized for his debts. Then there were the dower rights that protected widows. This was a crucial legal provision across much of medieval Europe. Upon her husband's death, a widow was legally entitled to a portion of his property, typically 1/3 of his lands for the rest of her life. This was not a gift from her husband, it was her legal right. This dower land provided an independent income and home for the widow, giving her economic stability and a significant degree of autonomy. Legal texts like Bracton's De Legibus et Consuetudinibus Angliae, written in the mid-13th century, meticulously detail these dower rights, illustrating their importance in safeguarding a widow's status. Widows frequently appeared in court to defend these rights, showing their active engagement with the legal system. For example, the Rolls of the King's Bench in England contain many cases where widows successfully sued to recover their rightful dower lands, asserting their property claims against male relatives or even the crown. Beyond formal legal frameworks, customary laws and local practices also offered women different degrees of legal standing. In some trading towns and cities, women, particularly married women, could operate as feme sole traders. This meant that if a married woman ran a business independently of her husband's trade, she could sue and be sued in her own name regarding her business dealings. This was a pragmatic recognition of women's economic contributions and allowed for smoother commercial transactions. The city ordinances of London, for example, codified these provisions, acknowledging the active role of women in the city's vibrant economy. Historian Caroline Barron's research on London's medieval population highlights numerous women running shops, taverns, and craft businesses with considerable independence. Even in matters of personal law, women often had recourse. In ecclesiastical courts, which handled issues like marriage, divorce, legitimacy, and wills, women could bring cases and testify. These courts sometimes offered avenues for women to challenge abusive marriages or assert their rights regarding their children's inheritance or their own marital property. Court records from the officials' court of the Archbishop of York, dating to the late 14th century, show women initiating suits for separation from abusive husbands or challenging the validity of a marriage contract. This legal avenue allowed them to seek justice in areas deeply personal to their well-being. Furthermore, medieval noblewomen, especially those holding significant estates, often wielded considerable legal and administrative power. A powerful countess or duchess might hold her own courts, administer justice, command vassals, and manage vast territories. They acted as legal authorities, presiding over cases, issuing charters, and enforcing laws within their domains. The lives of women like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Blanche of Castile demonstrate women operating at the highest levels of political and legal authority, making decisions that affected thousands of people and vast swathes of land. Their roles were not mere ceremonial positions, they were active participants in the legal and administrative governance of their territories, often demonstrating shrewd political and legal acumen. The presence of women's names in property deeds, tax records, and court documents across different social strata provides compelling evidence against the notion of their universal legal invisibility. From peasant women owning livestock and small plots of land to urban women running successful businesses and noble women governing entire regions, medieval women often had clear and enforceable legal identities and rights, challenging the popular myth of their complete powerlessness. The legal landscape was complex, varying by region, social class, and marital status, but it was far from a uniform suppression of women's legal existence. Number 5. The biggest lie told about medieval women's happiness. They were confined solely to the home. A persistent image of medieval women places them exclusively within the confines of the domestic sphere, busy with spinning, weaving, and child-rearing, rarely venturing beyond their doorstep. This idea paints a narrow picture of their lives, ignoring the vibrant and diverse roles women played in public life, the economy, and religious devotion outside the household. Medieval women were not just homemakers, they were active participants in every level of society, often undertaking demanding physical and intellectual labor in public spaces. Take the world of trade and commerce. Women were indispensable to local economies, especially in towns and cities. They were not just consumers, they were producers, sellers, and business owners. Many women ran stalls in public markets, selling everything from bread and ale to fish and textiles. These market women were a common sight, handling money, negotiating prices, and interacting with a wide array of people daily. Their records from Parisian tax rolls of the late 13th century, for example, show hundreds of women listed as independent heads of households, running businesses like breweries, laundries, and textile shops. They were actively involved in urban economic life. The brewing industry, in particular, was largely dominated by women for centuries. Alewives were common in towns and villages, brewing and selling ale directly from their homes or specialized alehouses. This was a significant economic activity that provided many women with an independent income and a public role. Guild records from various towns also show women involved in craft production. While many guilds limited full membership to men, women often worked alongside their husbands or fathers, acquiring skills and contributing to the family business. In some guilds, especially those related to textiles or food preparation, women could even be full members, run their own workshops, and train apprentices. For example, women were prominent in silk production guilds in cities like Paris and Cologne, managing complex operations. Beyond the urban setting, in rural areas, peasant women were integral to the agricultural economy. They worked alongside men in the fields, sowing, harvesting, and tending livestock. Their labor was essential for survival and food production. Historians like Judith Bennett have highlighted the extensive and often overlooked contributions of peasant women to the medieval agrarian economy, demonstrating that their lives were far from confined to the domestic space. They regularly moved between their homes, the fields, the communal threshing floors, and the local market. Women were also crucial to the hospitality industry. They worked as innkeepers, managing guest houses and taverns, serving travelers, and overseeing staff. This role required significant business acumen, social skills, and the ability to manage finances. And innkeepers were central figures in their communities, providing not only lodging but also social hubs for news and networking. The records of the Bishop of Hereford's visitations in the early 15th century mention numerous women running public houses. And religious life also provided women with significant public roles and opportunities to travel. Women embarked on pilgrimages to holy sites, sometimes traveling long distances across Europe. These journeys were not just spiritual exercises. They involved complex logistical planning, social interaction, and exposure to different cultures and environments. Nunneries and convents were also important centers of power and learning, often run by influential abbesses. These abbesses managed large estates, administered justice, patronized arts, and engaged in political dealings, often governing hundreds of people and vast amounts of land. For instance, Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, was a prolific writer, composer, and mystic who advised emperors and popes, illustrating the public intellectual and spiritual authority some women commanded. Even within noble households, women were not simply decorative figures. The lady of the manor often managed the household staff, oversaw finances, and in her husband's absence, could be responsible for the defense and administration of the estate. During times of war or crusades, it was common for noble women to manage castles, raise troops, and even lead defensive actions. The chronicles of the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 mention the wife of a knight, Lady Maud de Braose, who fiercely defended the castle against King John. These examples clearly show that medieval women's lives extended far beyond the walls of their homes. They were active participants in the public economy, religious life, and even the governance of their communities, roles that required them to navigate and influence the world outside their immediate domestic sphere. Number 4, the biggest lie told about medieval women's happiness: they were uneducated and illiterate. A common assumption about medieval women is that they lived in an intellectual dark age, with no access to books, education, or learned pursuits. The image often painted is one of universal literacy and a complete lack of intellectual engagement. However, historical evidence reveals a much more nuanced reality, showing that many medieval women, across different social strata, possessed literacy skills, engaged with written culture, and even contributed to it. The literacy in the Middle Ages was different from modern times. It wasn't always about reading and writing in the vernacular, but often about Latin, the language of the church and learning. While formal schooling was less widespread for women compared to men, it was by no means absent. Convents and nunneries were crucial centers of female literacy and learning. Your daughters of noble and wealthy families were often sent to these institutions, not just for religious instruction, but also for an education that included reading, writing, Latin, music, and sometimes even advanced subjects like medicine or astronomy. The nuns were expected to read religious texts, copy manuscripts, and even compose their own works. The letters and theological writings of Hrotsvita of Gandersheim, a 10th century German canoness, demonstrate a profound classical education and sophisticated literary skill. Beyond convents, some aristocratic women received private tutoring within their homes. These women were often trained in reading and writing, not only for religious devotion but also for managing complex households and estates. A lady of the manor needed to be able to read inventories, accounts, and legal documents. Noblewomen often had personal libraries and commissioned books, showing their active engagement with written culture. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was a patron of troubadour poetry and possessed a sophisticated appreciation for literature. Christine de Pizan, a renowned late 14th century author, wrote extensively in French, advocating for women's education and challenging prevailing misogynistic views. Her very existence and prolific output directly refute the idea of universal female illiteracy. In urban areas, particularly among the merchant and artisan classes, a more practical form of literacy was becoming increasingly common for both men and women. The wives and daughters of merchants often needed to be able to read and write for business purposes, keeping accounts, managing inventories, and corresponding with suppliers or customers. Evidence from guild records and urban court documents suggests that some women were certainly literate enough to handle these tasks. For example, shopkeepers and traders often had written tallies and records, and it is unreasonable to assume that only men performed these tasks. Furthermore, access to written culture was not limited to direct literacy. Many people, including women, experienced literature and religious texts through oral performances, listening to readings, or observing visual art that told stories. Even women who couldn't read themselves might have had access to books or scrolls through their family members or the local church. The spread of vernacular literature, like romances and devotional texts, made written works more accessible to a wider audience, including women. Their illustrated manuscripts, for example, could convey complex narratives even to those who could not read the accompanying text. There is also archaeological evidence that points to female literacy. Finds of writing implements in women's graves or personal belongings suggest that at least some women possessed the tools for writing. The presence of personal seals belonging to women, used for signing legal documents or letters, also implies a level of engagement with the written world. While widespread universal literacy, as we understand it today, was certainly not the norm for either men or women in the Middle Ages, dismissing medieval women as entirely uneducated and cut off from intellectual life is a gross misrepresentation. Their access to learning varied significantly by social class, geography, and personal circumstances, but many women were literate, engaged with books, contributed to scholarship, and actively participated in the intellectual and cultural life of their times. Number 3, the biggest lie told about medieval women's happiness: they were simply property in marriage. The idea that medieval women were merely possessions, exchanged as property in marriage, paints a grim picture of their autonomy and personal happiness. This widespread misconception overlooks the complex realities of medieval marriage practices, which, while often strategic and arranged, frequently involved a degree of female agency, negotiation, and even affection. The narrative of women as passive pawns misses much of the truth. Marriage in the Middle Ages was indeed a significant social and economic alliance, especially among the nobility and wealthy classes. It often served to consolidate land, forge political alliances, or secure social status. In these arranged marriages, the wishes of the bride and groom might have been secondary to the family's interests. However, even in such arrangements, a woman's consent was, in theory, often required by canon law, the law of the church. The church stipulated that a valid marriage required the free consent of both parties. While this consent could sometimes be coerced or implied, it did provide a legal framework that, at times, women could leverage to challenge unwanted unions. Many cases brought before ecclesiastical courts show women attempting to annul marriages they claimed they had not truly consented to. Moreover, the process of arrangement involved more than just male decision-making. Mothers, aunts, and grandmothers often played significant roles in negotiating marriage alliances, particularly concerning the prospects of their female relatives. They advised on dowry, suitability of matches, and the social standing of potential partners. These powerful female figures acted as intermediaries and advocates, shaping outcomes for their daughters and granddaughters. For example, letters from various noble families frequently show mothers actively involved in discussions about their children's marriages. The dowry, a gift or property that a bride brought into her marriage, was a crucial part of the marriage contract. While it often benefited the husband's family by increasing their assets, the dowry also gave the bride a degree of leverage and protection. It was her contribution to the marital estate, and its proper management and return in case of widowhood or annulment were important legal considerations. In some cases, a dowry could represent a significant economic contribution that elevated the bride's status within her new household. The dowry was not simply given away, its terms were negotiated, and its future was often subject to legal agreements that protected the wife's interests. Among the lower social classes, particularly peasants and artisans, marriages might have been less formally arranged and more often based on personal choice and practical considerations. Young people in villages and towns had more opportunities to meet and interact, leading to courtships and unions based on mutual attraction or shared economic goals. While parental role was still important, it was less about dynastic alliances and more about finding a suitable working partner for the household and farm. Village court records sometimes show disputes over broken betrothals, highlighting the personal commitments made between individuals rather than just family units. Even within arranged marriages, affection and companionship often developed over time. In medieval letters and chronicles frequently portray loving relationships between spouses. Marriages were partnerships, especially in the running of a household or an estate. Wives often managed household affairs, finances, and the upbringing of children, sharing responsibilities with their husbands. The correspondence between Margaret Paston and her husband John in the 15th century provides a vivid insight into a working partnership, mutual respect, and affection, even amidst the challenges of managing their family estates. Their letters discuss business, family matters, and personal well-being, demonstrating a relationship far removed from that of a property owner and his possession. Furthermore, women could and did resist forced marriages or seek annulments on various grounds, including lack of consent, consanguinity, or pre-existing vows. The ecclesiastical courts, which governed marriage, provided a legal avenue for women to seek remedies. While not always successful, the very existence of these legal challenges demonstrates that women were not entirely passive. They sought to exercise agency within the constraints of their society. The stories of women like Heloise, who chose intellectual and spiritual partnership over a conventional marriage, or the many women who resisted or challenged arranged unions, demonstrate a spectrum of agency that belies the simple property narrative. Number 2. The biggest lie told about medieval women's happiness: their lives were uniformly short and brutal. The narrative often presented about medieval women's lives is one of unremitting hardship, constant childbirth, and an early death, making any notion of happiness seem impossible. While medieval life certainly presented significant challenges for everyone, the idea that women's lives were universally short and brutal is an oversimplification. This perspective ignores variations in experience based on social class, geography, and individual circumstances, and it overlooks periods of relative stability and even opportunities for satisfaction. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was indeed lower than today, often cited around 30 to 35 years. However, this average is heavily skewed by high infant and child mortality rates. If a woman survived childhood, her chances of living longer significantly increased. Many women lived into their 40s, 50s, and even beyond, particularly if they survived the dangers of childbirth in their younger years. Grave inscriptions and wills from the period often show women living into what would be considered middle and old age for the time. For instance, archaeological studies of cemeteries sometimes reveal skeletal remains of women who reach 60 or 70 years of age. Childbirth was undeniably perilous, a leading cause of death for women of reproductive age. However, not every pregnancy ended in tragedy, and many women survived multiple births. Medical texts from the period, though limited by modern standards, show that midwives and traditional healers possessed practical knowledge that sometimes aided in safe deliveries. The frequency of childbirth also varied. Wealthy women might have had more children, while poorer women facing economic hardship might have had fewer successful pregnancies or more spaced out births due to nutritional factors. The idea of constant, uninterrupted childbearing until death is not always supported by detailed family histories. Beyond the stark statistics, the quality of life varied greatly. For noble women, life, while perhaps constrained by social expectations and arranged marriages, often included access to better food, housing, medical care, and less physically demanding labor than peasant women. They might have enjoyed patronage of the arts, extensive travel, and the management of large households with many servants. Their happiness might have stemmed from fulfilling their social duties, raising successful children, or engaging in courtly life. The lives of women like Eleanor of Castile, Queen of England, who traveled widely, managed considerable resources, and influenced political decisions, were far from uniformly brutal. For women in towns, particularly those involved in crafts and commerce, life was often dynamic and offered opportunities for economic independence. As discussed earlier, women ran businesses, participated in guilds, and contributed significantly to urban economies. Their lives, while demanding, offered agency and a sense of purpose from their work. The social interaction in markets, workshops, and communal gatherings could provide a sense of community and connection that mitigated hardship. Even for peasant women, whose lives involved strenuous physical labor and susceptibility to famine and disease, there were periods of relative peace and community. Life was cyclical, dictated by agricultural seasons. While demanding, the work was often shared within families and communities, fostering strong social bonds. Festivals, religious celebrations, and local gatherings provided much-needed breaks from labor and opportunities for joy and social interaction. Medieval songs, stories, and art often depict scenes of peasant life that, while realistic about hard work, also show moments of celebration, camaraderie, and simple pleasures. For instance, the illustrated Luttrell Psalter from the early 14th century depicts detailed scenes of English rural life, showing women engaged in field work but also participating in feasts and dances. It is important to avoid projecting modern sensibilities of happiness onto a different historical context. Satisfaction for medieval women might have come from different sources: successful child rearing, a productive household, spiritual devotion, social standing, or simply survival and health. While challenges were ever present, the absence of modern comforts does not equate to a perpetual state of misery. Many medieval women, like their male counterparts, found meaning, purpose, and moments of contentment within the framework of their lives. Number 1. The biggest lie told about medieval women's happiness. They were universally silent and without influence. The pervasive myth suggests that medieval women were passive figures, utterly without voice or influence, their lives defined by silence and submission. This portrayal often ignores the myriad ways women exerted power, expressed themselves, and shaped their communities, families, and even political landscapes. While public spheres were largely dominated by men, women found and created spaces for influence, asserting their agency in ways that challenged the notion of universal voicelessness. One of the most significant arenas for female influence was the household, especially for noble and wealthy women. The lady of the manor or castle was not just a domestic manager. She was often a powerful figure who controlled vast resources, managed numerous servants, and oversaw economic production. In her husband's absence, or after his death, she might administer justice, collect rents, and even lead defensive operations. There were women like Philippa of Hainault, Queen of England in the 14th century, actively engaged in political affairs, acted as regent in her husband's absence, and even led troops in battle during the 100 Years' War. Her actions demonstrate a clear exercise of power and influence. In religious life, women found powerful voices and exerted significant influence. Abbesses of powerful convents managed large estates, engaged in diplomacy, and often advised powerful secular rulers. These women provided spiritual and intellectual leadership, running institutions that were centers of learning and patronage. As women mystics and visionaries, such as Catherine of Siena or Bridget of Sweden, communicated directly with God in their own understanding, often gaining immense spiritual authority. Their prophecies and advice were sought by popes, kings, and common people alike. They wrote extensively, attracting followers and shaping religious thought, directly challenging any notion of female silence. Women also exerted influence through patronage. Wealthy women commissioned significant works of art, literature, and architecture. By financially supporting artists, scribes, and artisans, they shaped cultural trends and preserved knowledge. For instance, Marie de Champagne, a 12th century countess, was a major patron of Chrétien de Troyes, one of the most influential writers of Arthurian romance. Her patronage directly influenced the development of medieval literature. Within marriage, while legal structures often placed power with the husband, wives frequently exerted informal influence through persuasion, advice, and emotional leverage. Letters between spouses often reveal wives providing counsel on business matters, political strategy, and family decisions. The Passion Letters, a collection of correspondence from a 15th century English family, show wives actively participating in decisions about land management, family alliances, and legal disputes, often expressing strong opinions and driving important actions. Even in lower social strata, women's voices were heard. In towns and villages, women participated in market life, social gatherings, and community events, where gossip, news, and opinions were freely exchanged. They formed networks and solidarity among themselves, influencing local affairs through informal channels. Women also appeared in courts, testifying, bringing suits, and defending themselves, clearly articulating their positions and seeking justice. Records from manorial courts across England show peasant women actively engaging in legal disputes concerning land, livestock, and personal matters. Furthermore, women were storytellers and preservers of oral traditions. They passed down knowledge, folklore, and family histories. Their narratives shaped cultural understanding and maintained social norms within their communities. Women's laments, songs, and poems, though less frequently written down, were vital forms of expression and influence in oral culture. While public political office was largely closed to women, their influence was manifest in various forms through personal relationships, spiritual authority, economic power, cultural patronage, and the informal networks of community life. To claim they were universally silent and without influence ignores the rich tapestry of medieval female lives and the many ways they actively shaped their world.